unmute yourself, or if you prefer, then you can just type in your question in the chat box, and then either Lemis or I will just read it out on your behalf. And yeah, as you've probably just heard, we will be recording this event for everyone that couldn't make it with us here today. But with those logistics covered, I think it's time for us to just go ahead and say hi to Susan. So hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you both, and thank you all for coming and for hosting me.
Awesome, it's our pleasure. So I guess just starting off, how have you been these past few months? It's been strange for all of us, but I just want to see on your side of the pond, how are things going?
I mean, it's things are things are a bit of a chaotic here in terms of the response to COVID. I'm sure you can see that in the news. But I mean, for me personally, I'm kind of an introvert anyways. I just kind of work from my home and I live with my dogs. So it's not a huge departure to be in lockdown, to be honest. But I have to say that the accretion of days has it starts to get to you, and I have been I've created a pod with my friends and we're managing. Thank you for asking. I hope you guys are doing well also.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar situation this side as well. Things change every day. But yeah, I think it's so important to kind of build that support network and have people where you just get through things day by day. But that's awesome to see you're holding up well. And I guess you're right, as a writer, probably just about managed to keep writing, and so hopefully everything's okay on that front. But now, just for everyone who's joining the call that maybe isn't familiar with you or your work, could we just start with maybe a bit of an early background and where you're born and your basically growing up phase, I guess.
Well, I was born in Kuwait. My parents were refugees from the 1967 war when Israel conquered the remainder of Palestine. I lived in Jerusalem. I lived in Jordan and Kuwait, and then finally in the United States, where I've been since I was 13 years old. I'm also a lot of people don't know this, but my background is in science. I started out as a scientist because Arab families think that there's only one profession in the world, either a doctor or a doctor or
Yeah,
a doctor. So I went
I
that.
don't think it's a coincidence that Lemis and I are both medics. But yeah.
So
Um,
yeah, but then life
so,
took me
oh,
another.
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. That is one thing I wanted to get into maybe a bit later on, actually, at how that ended up with you writing some amazing like novels and in English as well, which I guess wouldn't have been your first language growing up. But before that, I wanted to start off with the kind of theme of identity, and it's one that's prominent in your book Mornings in Jenin. And I think in general with the issue of Palestine, the issue of identity just comes hand in hand in that. So just to begin with, broadly, what does it mean to you to be a Palestinian? And what do you think some of the like shared experiences are between Palestinians, both in Palestine and in the diaspora?
Um, well, I mean, we are one nation. I mean, it's not just what are the shared experiences. We're just separated geographically by a settler colonial state that was founded on the ethnic cleansing of our society. Um, but we remain one nation. Uh, the in terms of identity, um, we are a people whose very existence for a very long time was denied, and actually continues to be denied. I mean, there's still this um, strangely accepted narrative that some people who were gone for 3,000 years came home to an empty place, and that we, and then we just kind of decided that out of some inherent anti-Semitism that we wanted to kick them out. It's really, it's not only like it's not only is it pure fantasy, but it always kind of boggles my mind how many people believe this, continue to believe that, Palestinians who had, verifiably been there for millennia, who established the local culture, the local cuisine, the local food, the local clothes, dance, songs, folklore, who terraced all the hills in that place, who planted its soil and developed its agriculture, built its cities, that somehow we were just sort of interlopers. And, to come from this extraordinarily rich and beautiful and fabled land where that has a deep monotheistic religion, this has these deep stories that are associated with all three monotheistic religions, is what I was trying to say. It feels like a real privilege to me. And then to have that, and then to have your presence and your attachment to that place actively severed and publicly denied is shocking to the heart and to the mind and to one's spiritual existence in the world. And it's
Yeah.
and so we all kind of exist regardless of where we live, right? These geographic separations have also created psychological separations, linguistic separations, and there's no denying that. But we, all of us, still are united by this common anguish, this common wound, this collective wound that has been inflicted on all of us. So no matter where we are in the world, the trajectory of our lives has been determined by these two moments in history of our exile. One was in 1948 and one was in 1967.
Yeah.
And this unites us, and this and we write from this wound. We derive our motivations, our songs, our culture, our literature, going forward from in the way we speak to each other and the way we express ourselves creatively. Much of that comes from two things. One is this, like I said, this creative, this collective wound, and the other is this ancient history that we share and these very deep roots in a single place.
Yeah, that I agree with so much of what you said. And the richness and the love is so strong and is felt by so many people across generations. But actually one thing, so from my perspective, I'm Palestinian through my mum's side, and we visit Jordan every year because that's where like her side ended up having to go to escape the persecution. And then my closest experience of Palestine, I've never actually been, but my closest experience is just being on the other side of Bahr al-Mayyit, so the other side of the Dead Sea, and just looking at those mountains. And I feel a sense of that connection and that love, and like the home that I've never been to. But is there a part of you that worries that over the generations, as you get more generations of people who've never been to Palestine, so me myself, I can
Sorry,
hear the
your
stories of
voice
my.
just went away.
Oops, am I back?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I was just saying, so myself, I can hear like a first-hand account, so from my grandma about Palestine, but then my kids aren't going to have that. And is there a part of you where you worry over the generations this love might dissipate somewhat?
Yeah, I think we all worry about that. But I think that's what Zionists predicted, right? David Ben Gurion once said, the old will die and the young will forget. but he has
Mm.
proven woefully wrong, you know. The young have not forgotten it. I mean, even Palestinians who've never been to Palestine, who have only inherited memories of Palestine, um, you know, continue to struggle, and like you're doing. I mean, you know, you're holding these conversations, you're bringing Palestinian writers, and we're just, this is a form, this is part of the struggle, this is part of holding on to our roots and to our memories. um and besides that, I mean, this is a very crucial social justice and political justice issue. And I would say that is probably the defining political issue of our time. It is, you know, uh, it's the West's only remaining settler colonial enterprise. I mean, besides the United States, of course. But it is at least the most recent settler colonial enterprise from of the West, I would say. Um, yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that yes, there is a danger of future generations forgetting, but there really hasn't been a lot of evidence of that, really. My daughter doesn't really speak Arabic very well, and she understands it. But she strangely has a very deep connection to Palestine. I mean, she goes there. She doesn't have the same history that I have. You know, I lived there. I have family. I mean, I'm fluent in Arabic in a way that she's not. But that hasn't lessened her connection. So
Mm.
we will endure.
Would you recommend, so I've always had the desire to one year when I'm in Jordan to visit Palestine. Obviously, it's just crossing the matter of crossing the border, but that's a lot harder than it sounds. There is typically like long delays at the border, and I think it's made purposefully difficult for people to cross over from Jordan to Palestine.
Mhm.
But how important do you actually, like, would you really recommend that I go to Palestine as soon as possible, or do you think it's not like a necessary or essential thing to like be part of the movement and have that connection?
I mean, I think that's a very personal choice. I do think going there um, is a transforming experience. I think it's an entirely different thing to read about things and to speak about them, or watch them on a screen or something, than to actually be there and experience the culture and experience the occupation. And you know, I'll give you an example. Actually, the genesis of Mornings in Jenin happened when I traveled to Palestine, uh, um, when there were reports of a massacre taking place in Jenin. And you know, I grew up um, seeing images of Sabra and Shatila. I mean, I remember, you know, it happened when I was 13 years old, or 12 or 13 years old. And it was, you know, seeing those images was really shocking. It was the first time I think I'd seen something so gruesome. Um, and you know, but we saw stuff on TV, and you know about these things, but it was an entirely different matter to be there
Mm,
and to smell death, and to see that level of destruction, and also to see to be with my people, you know,
yeah.
to go to the olive harvest, to experience the joy, to experience the determination, the resilience, um, to be part of to be part of your family and your people in the place where we all started. It is transformative in a way that is difficult to put into words and to really convey unless you go. And I think a lot of people say that. And I'll tell you, like, for example, my daughter's connection to Palestine was quite abstract before she actually went there. When she was a teenager, she went on a trip to go Palestine, and that changed her. That, you know, she now had a real connection. She had friends there. She had seen the terrain. She had walked those hills. She had eaten the food, you know, smelled the natural flora and just the outdoors. Every place has distinct sensory details uh, that you can't experience from afar. So I guess I would say I would recommend, you know, that young people go. Um, but
Yeah, I
again,
think,
it's a personal experience. It's a personal
yeah.
decision.
I think that experience of, if and when I do go, I guess, of suddenly being surrounded by Palestinians is just going to be completely overwhelming, because it's normally a fact, like in London, it's the like one face in the crowd where you might see a Palestinian and you have that connection, but it must be completely overwhelming to be completely like immersed in that. But you mentioned, so the genesis of Mornings in Jenin, and obviously coming out of your visit to Jenin. I wanted to ask, like, how your personal experiences and your identity and everything kind of funneled into that book, and how it shaped your writing. And did you really like lean into those experiences? And I guess to what extent did they influence your books?
So I've never really thought of myself as a writer. I mean, growing up, it wasn't like, you know, I dreamed of being a writer. As a matter of fact, I mean, we, you know, like I said earlier, I came from a family that was more focused on, you know, the sciences and sort of, you know, concrete professions that, you know, they would consider real jobs. And
Mm,
I also didn't think that literature was something I could aspire to. It was kind of like thinking I could be the Queen of England someday. It was just, it felt that remote and inaccessible to me. And so I didn't, but I did write though when I was younger. So a lot of these things kind of become, you know, apparent in retrospect. When I was very young, I used to write poetry it was all in Arabic, of course, and apparently I was quite good at it. I'm told none of that remains, unfortunately. But after during the second Intifada, I started writing political commentary, and it was a bit surprising to me that editors were picking up my stuff and wanting me to write more. So I kept doing that, and I was, you know, I became more of an activist during the second Intifada, and that's what took me to Jenin. Um, Simultaneously, I was catching the attention of a lot of my bosses at work. I worked for a drug company as a researcher, and to my unbeknownst to me, they were quite dismayed seeing my name attached to articles that were, you know, critical of Israel and of U.S. foreign policy. And it eventually got me fired from my job. And this was sort of in the wake of 9/11, when it was, you know, a lot of stuff was happening
mm,
that wouldn't ordinarily happen in normal times. But, you know, suddenly being without a job, without an income, I was a single mother. I really wasn't making much money. I had no savings. I don't have family in this country. And it was quite terrifying. And the only thing I really knew to do the next morning was to start writing about my experience in Jenin, which had just happened weeks before. And I initially thought I was writing a just kind of an op-ed, or, you know, just an essay. But I kept writing, and at some point I realized that this was going to be a novel. Um, I don't know what made me think that I could write a novel. I mean, there was nothing in my life to give me that confidence, and I think that had I stopped to really think about it, I probably wouldn't have had the guts to go forward. But luckily, I'm kind of an impulsive person who does things without thinking sometimes. So it worked out. And uh, yeah, and I kept writing. I mortgaged my house. I took out, you know, loans on my house, and I went into massive debt because I was just so focused on writing this book. But it did take years to finally get published, and you know, and the rest is history. And I realized that, you know, that I had this skill that I enjoyed and loved immensely, and got a great deal of personal satisfaction and meaning from. So I stuck with it.
Yeah, that whole process is just so fascinating to hear about. And I think you can actually, well, I think I can tell reading the book that the raw emotion and just the depth of the story like comes first and foremost, and the book is the medium that the story is delivered like through. But I think the raw emotion perhaps is to do with the fact that it wasn't meant to be a writing exercise. It was just telling a story. So that's really fascinating to hear about. I don't want to ask too many questions before handing over to Lemise because I know she has some questions that she wants to ask as well. So I'll let Lemise take over a bit.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you about something that you said earlier, and it really, I don't know, I really just like the phrasing of it. You said something like you write from a wound, and Palestinians, you had that experience right from the wound. And I just wanted to ask, because when I was reading Mornings in Jenin, you capture such a beautiful sense of Palestine before 1948. And in our age, we mostly just hear about the conflict and the oppression. So what was the motivation behind that? Like, why do you think it was important to make sure that people understood the beauty behind Palestine?
Because because we're not just about conflict. We're not just these political creatures. We are, as I said before, we are a society that's deeply rooted in the land. We were a primarily agrarian society, but there were urban centers and intellectuals and libraries and businesses and banks and modern institutions in Palestine. There was a complete life that had spanned centuries and that had developed organically. I mean, our society has genetically, we go back to the Canaanites, the earliest peoples who were there, and the society itself formed organically over millennia of conquests and rapes and pilgrimages and migrations, and the way that all societies develop and get to a point in life. And so we were there, and we had been there, and we understood the lands, and we had established traditions and established culture and an established heritage. And it is important to talk about that, to write about it, to celebrate it, to memorialize it, because it's being erased. And not only is it being erased, it's actually being stolen. I mean, you have Israelis now talking about, this is Israeli couscous and Israeli hummus and Israeli falafel and Israeli shakshuka. And now they have these Israeli kufiyas, these black and white. I mean, and now they're also doing like Israeli depkes. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, the chutzpah, to be honest, is astounding. And I'm not sure. I always wonder, like, do they actually believe this, or do they know that they're stealing, the indigenous? They're in trying to indigenize themselves. They're stealing our culture. And it always reminds me of there's a comedian in the U.S. His name is Paul Mooney, and he always says everybody wants to be black, but nobody wants to be black. And this is the same. Israelis, they want to be Palestinians, but they don't want to be Palestinians. They want everything we have, everything we've created over centuries. They want to take that. They want to appropriate that. They hate that the only photos of Palestine since photography was developed are actually of Palestinians and not the Ashkenazi Jews or the current residents of the land. So they hate all these things, and they have actively been appropriating them and claiming them as their own. So, to your question, it is important to lay claim to what has been bequeathed to us by our ancestors, and to celebrate that, and also to reject this sort of Western dichotomy about us that depicts us as either these monstrous irrational, sort of hateful people on the one hand, or on the left, we are these pitiable refugees caught in, you know, endlessly oppressed and whatnot. We are neither of those things. We are a whole society, complete with, you know, spanning the full spectrum of humanity and all that humanity has to offer in the way of goodness and wickedness and all of that. So, and this is the importance of literature, I think, because you know, this is where we can exist in the fullness of our humanity to penetrate popular imagination around the world that has turned us into cartoons and two-dimensional characters to suit whatever narrative is convenient for them at the time. It is a place to be defiant. It is a place to insist on our humanity, to insist on our natural rights, to defend our homes, to defend our land, to protect this earth, to protect our children. So literature is an extraordinarily powerful landscape, and I think that is where you know, I have laid my struggle.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree, because even when I was reading, I realized that I understood more from a perspective that I'd never looked at. And I saw both, you know, the really heartbreaking conflict and oppression, as well as seeing the beautiful side of Palestine. I think it's really important for us to embrace that beautiful side and start to appreciate it, which is something that many societies do, such as us at Palestine. We really try to, you know, encourage people to come to Debka workshops, look at Palestinian embroidery, all of that. So yeah, thank you for that. And I noticed also something that is really important is literature, like you said. And throughout the book, I noticed there was a link back to Arabic phrases of greetings and thanks. So how important is it in having language and connecting it to the land? So how important is language and having a connection with the land itself?
Language is hugely important, and I wanted to point something out in, you know, in what you were saying. The use of our words matter, and you know, you referred to this as a conflict, and I think that most of the world refers to it as a conflict, but it's not a conflict. It's a settler colonial enterprise. You know, nobody would describe the Jewish Holocaust as a conflict. Nobody would describe the institution of slavery as a conflict. This is not a conflict. Conflict happens between two parties that are more or less equal and who are fighting on equal terms of power. This is, you know, the situation with Palestine is that a principally unarmed, defenseless indigenous society is being erased and exterminated by a settler colonial society that inherently believes that they are a more worthy form of human with greater rights in that land, which has resulted now in the expulsion of the vast majority of the indigenous population, the ghettoization of those who remain, the apartheid, multiple tiers of laws based on one's religion, which is defined as apartheid. So language matters, and how we speak of this issue matters, the words we use. And I think that's important. It's also, you know, literature is also a place where we can reach our young people. You know, I mean, for our youth, people like you who've never been to Palestine, who maybe have this sort of abstract connection through grandparents or parents. This is a place, literature is a place where you can go there. You know, you can meet your ancestors. You can taste the food and hear the music and live with a family that has been through a period of time there. In fact, some of the most meaningful letters from readers that I've received have come from young Palestinians in the diaspora. For example, this one letter that I remember so clearly actually made me cry. This young woman wrote to me and said that she and all of her siblings read Mornings in Jenin, and they felt like it was the first time that they ever truly understood their father, with whom they had had a difficult relationship growing up, because he was just, forever sort of anguished over his exile. So these, this is to me an example of how powerful literature can be in binding us, in bridging the gap between our ancestors and exiled generations.
So I also, how was it a conscious effort that you made in connecting like the Arabic language with inside the book? Or was that just
no, it was intentional. I mean, first of all, I mean, there's some words in Arabic that really cannot be translated, and the translation just is so decontextualized that it's almost like, if you're an Arabic speaking person, it's painful to see. Words like inshallah, yes, you can translate it to God willing, right? But it's not
Not the
quite
same.
right. It's not. So, particularly if if you have mothers and grandmothers who would just say inshallah to shut you up, when you're a kid and you want some candy, inshallah, I'll get you that, and so no, that like some words should not be translated. Alhamdulillah, thank God. Yeah, okay. But it's some words that are such a part of our daily linguistic life. Arabic is a series of calls and responses, right? It's a dance, really. Like, and when I was young, it used to annoy me, right? Because it's like, just get on with it, like stop with the back and forth, but as an adult, I realize how beautiful that is, what it means in terms of human connections. And there's a line or there's a part, actually a paragraph in Mornings in Jenin, where Amal, the main character, comes to the United States, and she says she wants to say thank you to someone, and she says how that word never feels right. So in English, there's only these two little words to express gratitude, thank you. But in Arabic, it's actually there's a whole infinite language that's associated with gratitude. And it's always with this prayerful appreciation, may God bless the hands that cook this meal for me. May the next time, inshallah, we come to your house in celebration of a wedding, it's just, gratitude is a whole series of calls and responses. And I mean, it's a whole landscape in itself. And so she says in the book, coming from such a culture where gratitude is this expansive linguistic terrain, her voice, she always felt really miserly and ungrateful when she just said thank you. So I wanted to keep those expressions in the book, but those were translated, but they were, I wanted that language of gratitude to be in its original form. Other words too, I actually sometimes don't realize how much Arabic I've left in there. Like in my last book, I didn't I was thinking, oh, at most there's like, 10 or 12 things. But when it came time to creating a glossary, it was like, I don't know, there's like over 60 or 80 words or something like that. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I also wanted to ask, it's something that I'm very interested in, especially because it's very rare that you get to speak to people who have like real experience in Palestine. And you said you were 13 when the Sabra and Shatila massacre happened. I wanted to ask, are there like any other specific stories that stick out in your memory when you think about your time spent in Palestine and how that's affected you as you've grown older?
So in Mornings in Jenin, yes, of course. And my experience in Palestine has, is in my books. In fact, there's a whole chapter in Mornings in Jenin that's entirely autobiographical. It's the orphanage chapter. I put the main character in my life when I lived in Jerusalem. I lived in an orphanage for girls called Dar al-Tifl. I have a lot of memories that, I didn't realize it at the time, but that experience really shaped my life for years to come. They were, they were like everyone's childhood. It was a mixed bag, both good and difficult memories in Palestine. But certainly, the experience of living there, of being where I was supposed to be, being in the place that was supposed to be my destiny, and then being forced to leave. And also while there, we lived under occupation, of course, and I, you can never avoid moments with soldiers, to put it mildly, and run into the extreme racism of Israeli society. And I'll give you an example. So I'll give you two examples actually. My cousins took me to a pool in Jerusalem one time, and it was a public pool. Arabs, Palestinians were allowed, with who lived in Jerusalem, but it was mostly for Jews. And so I went, and I was wearing a bathing suit, and I think that the assumption was that Arab girls don't wear bathing suits, but I had a bathing suit on, and I was playing with these girls. But when they realized that I was Palestinian, they just started splashing me out of the pool, and calling me names and things like that. It was, of course, I left in tears. And then there was another moment, actually, those same cousins came to get me from the school. They were older than me. They were a few years older. So they would have been young teens at most, maybe 13 or 14. And, it was, I think, maybe Eid holiday or something. And they came to pick me up to take me to my aunt's house. And on the way, we were stopped by a group of soldiers who just wanted to have some fun, apparently. And they wouldn't let us continue on our journey until my cousins had succeeded. They made them sit across from each other, and they wouldn't allow us to go until they had succeeded in spitting in each other's mouths. And they had to sort of, spit a distance, and the other one had to open their mouth. And of course, they were crying, and I was crying. I peed myself. But this was, and the soldiers were laughing, of course, and they finally let us go laughing. And it's like, you talk about these little things, but when people are literally being murdered in the street, maybe it doesn't have meaning, but the accumulation of these daily humiliations and daily assaults on children has traumatized our society. We have our society, like all oppressed societies, are deeply traumatized by and deeply humiliated by by young Israeli men in uniform who have an overload of testosterone and way too much power over the lives of Palestinians. So yes, I am, this stuff always shows up in the things I write, because they live in my heart, and they have shaped who I am to some extent.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was quite a like shocking and traumatic experience, surely. And I know a lot of us like can't relate, and it's quite sad to know that this is what's happening, and this is something that's always happening in Palestine. So Abdullah, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, I actually wanted so hopefully we'll go to Q&A in a bit, but there was just a couple more things I wanted to ask about. And actually you mentioned that one of the chapters was essentially like an autobiography, and I just remember like having that experience of reading the book and not actually knowing, like, is this fiction, is this a novel, is this a true biography? And I think the richness of the stories and the fact that, yeah, okay, this might be a novel and have elements of fiction, but the story is true, and there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that have these kind of experiences. And I guess we should all be thankful that you managed to put it all down on a page for people to read about and experience themselves. So actually, my question is slightly different. It's about a later part of the book, when a man goes to America, and you mentioned obviously in the white community she felt a bit out of place, but then in the more ethnic minority communities and the Afro-Caribbean communities, there was more of a sense of like camaraderie or solidarity there, which makes sense in terms of people who've been oppressed having solidarity with each other. But I was wondering, actually, sometimes it's a bit disappointing when there isn't that sense of solidarity sometimes in the real world between different groups of oppressed people. And even like more disgustingly, sometimes when you have cases of even like Arabs and Palestinians being racist towards Black people. And it's almost in a sense unfathomable that people who've been so oppressed could do this to other people. And then I guess in another sense, it almost not makes sense, but it kind of plays out. But I just kind of wanted to ask what you think about like different movements and how they can have more solidarity with each other, and also the cases where Palestinians being racist.
Yeah. So Palestinians are, like a lot of colonized people, are colonized in their minds. Frantz Fanon wrote quite a lot about this, and I would recommend his book to anyone who wants to, who's an activist or who's becoming an activist. There is this sort of aspiration to whiteness and this sort of deeply ingrained sense of inferiority and self-hate that makes them want to be like white people. And one of the defining features of whiteness is its anti-Blackness. So, you know, these are, it's, I mean, it's disgusting. But it, you know, it has an explanation. And the solidarity between Palestinians and oppressed communities all over the world, in particular African Americans, goes back, not just African Americans, but African peoples in general, but in particular African Americans, goes back to the non-aligned movement, you know, to the 60s and 70s, when, you know, the alliances and the mutual support between organizations like the PLO, the ANC, the Black Panthers, and all these other leftist guerrilla movements around the world. So we have a long history of mutual solidarity, and that has continued in this country, but it has gained a new life with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which itself is not It's not something new, right? It's a new iteration of a very long struggle for Black liberation that has been going on for 400 years in this country. And this is something, you know, the need to understand who our friends are in the world is something that I have written about and lectured about quite a lot. And it is to see, you know, we tend to have this very Eurocentric dialogue with the world, which is, it's both embarrassing um, and futile, frankly. So, you know, we always sort of want to convince Europeans that, oh, we're human like you, we're good, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
When in fact, you know, the people, they're not our friends, and they have shown us, you know, time and again that they're not our friends. They hold us in complete contempt. They don't even think we're worthy. But we have friends, we have real friends, and it's mostly in the global South. And I think that we have to, as activists, as writers, we have to reorient this conversation towards our friends and towards this reciprocal mutual solidarity.
Yeah, I definitely do agree with that, especially recently when we've seen the peace plans and we've realized that even our friends may not be our friends when it comes to things that benefit them. I just wanted to ask specifically as well, because I know that a lot of people here are members of Friends of Palestine, and I wanted to ask, what would your advice be to, you know, student activists? How can we do our part in raising awareness and showing appreciation to Palestine?
So I mean, I think you're doing it. Continue to have these conversations, and more importantly, continue to educate yourselves. I mean, I don't assume that I know everything, and I am always learning about my origins, about my country, whether it's it's historic, whether it's cultural, whether it's scientific, environmental. I mean, you know, there's so much that is buried about us and about our history and our heritage. And I think it is really important for us to continue to uncover that. I mean, we had a feminist movement in Palestine. We had a scientific movement. There was so much in Palestine that gets left out of the conversation about Palestine. And I think it's important to remember that we are a complete society with an ancient history. We are not just, who we are in relation to Israel. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think, to continually foster solidarity and and if you are an activist for Palestine, you must be an activist for Black liberation, because you're not really an activist for Palestine if you're not standing shoulder to shoulder with our Black and brown comrades in other struggles. I mean, I think that is paramount to every struggle, is to understand the importance of internationalism and the importance of solidarity, of showing up for other people and not just being the recipients of solidarity.
Yeah, that's very interesting you say that, because just today I saw something that said an activist will never stop being an activist because there's always going to be injustice in the world. And yeah, I definitely do agree with that. We do have to, as you know, Arabs and non-Arabs, stand up for all kinds of injustices, whether it's with the Black Lives Matter movement and Palestine and all over the world. I also wanted to ask something. I know you founded Playgrounds for Palestine, which basically focuses on providing playgrounds, from what I understand, for Palestinian children. And I just wanted to ask, what was your motivation behind that? Why is it, because I just think it's beautiful that someone actually pays attention, and it's not just, you know, also providing water and food for Palestinian children, but we're now focusing on things that are, you know, almost seen as a luxury, like providing Palestinian children with things that children in general should have, such as playgrounds.
Yeah, and actually that was one of the criticisms when I started this organization, was that, oh, they need food and medicine and whatnot. And my answer was always, do you think that's all your kids need? Children deserve to play. And this was, I started Playgrounds for Palestine at a time in my life when I was a young mother with a child whose favorite thing in the world to do was to go to a playground. And we went almost every day after school when she was young. And when I went to Palestine after being gone for so long, the absence of playgrounds was really apparent and glaring to me. And this kind of goes back to my, not really thinking things through. And again, I think if I had really thought about it and thought about how difficult and complicated it would be, I would have never done it. But it was another one of my impulsive decisions, and I started it, and there was no turning back. And it was a moment. It was kind of the, if you build it, they will come, and that's what happened. We have an amazing group of women who sit on the board of this, and they all work very hard. We all do, in raising money, where it's a completely volunteer organization. And we actually have a UK chapter now, of a wonderful group of British citizens who who are raising money and building playgrounds. So yeah, it's been a really nice little kind of mom and pop organizations, I say.
I think it's really lovely, and to see that, we're now focusing on let's let Palestinian kids enjoy their lives. It's not just about the bare necessities. They deserve just as good life as any other child.
I think a lot of people have a lot to thank your impulsivity for, both in regards to writing the book and starting that charity. But it's been so amazing to hear more about writing the book, your experiences in Palestine. And I just want to open it up now to questions from the audience, because I think Limis and I have had our fair share of being able to ask you questions, but I want to give other people the opportunity to ask anything. And okay, straight away we've got a question in the chat. I'll just read it out. And I already know I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but how did your debate with Alan Dershowitz and his denial of genocidal events you witnessed impact your writing? And does it worry you that someone with his power and political affiliations could hold such views?
First of all, sorry, my dogs are, I don't know, I probably see a squirrel outside. Alan Dershowitz doesn't influence me at all. He's an idiot that I just really don't care about. It was interesting to be in that debate with him and watch him just lose his shit. It was kind of fun, to be honest. Alan Dershowitz is currently accused of being involved in child sex trafficking. I mean, he was very much a part of the Steve Epstein team. I don't know if you know much about that story here in the United States. It was rather explosive. Dershowitz is he's an ethnic cleansing enthusiast. He's a war crimes enthusiast. He has written in defense, basically, of Israeli war crimes, and he's a very hateful person. But it was interesting to be in that debate with him, where he really had no answers except to call me names and just kind of go nuts. So, yeah, I have no respect for him whatsoever, and I think most serious people don't either. I mean, he just calls everybody names. I mean, he's called Jimmy Carter really vile names. He's called Desmond Tutu horrible names. He's called just about every moral authority you can imagine. He's called them names, and so when he calls me names and I'm in that company, it's quite an honor.
Questions now.
Yeah.
So someone's asked, how do you think the recent peace treaties will impact Palestinians?
I mean, first of all, they're not peace treaties. I mean, those countries were never at war to begin with, so it's kind of stupid calling them peace treaties. But it serves them to call them that. It serves their interest to pretend like, oh, this is a peace treaty. But in fact, it's a normalization of Palestinian oppression treaty. It's a normalization of settler colonialism. And Ali Abulhawa tweeted something that I retweeted, and so these aren't my words, but they are fundamentally truthful and correct. That these accords stem from a very fundamental Arab self-hate and sense of inferiority, and this desire to kind of, sit at the tables at the White House and kind of be part of this white privileged world. It's embarrassing. It's really, to see their sycophantic behavior has been cringeworthy for everyone watching it. And but at the same time, I won't say that it's not hurtful. It is, because it feels like the whole world is turning their backs on us. Our blood is in the streets, and they're just walking right over us. But at the same time, there has been a real reaction to this kind of normalizing of fascism and the resurgence of fascism, right? It's been, the world is becoming increasingly polarized along these lines. And certainly Israel falls on the lines of fascism, and anyone who normalizes what they do, it becomes entrenched on that side of history. And at the same time, there has been this very inspiring reaction to these new political realities. There's been renewed activism, renewed vigor, renewed anger and fight. And just yesterday, there was this, or the day before, it was this brilliant news from Bolivia. This Evo Morales' Socialist Party won despite all these efforts by the United States. And the coup that the CIA supported, and to remove Evo Morales, and then the Bolivian people spoke, and they spoke very loudly, and they reinstalled a new leader from the Socialist Party. So there is, these things are expressions of indigenous people rising and oppressed people banding together and finding their power. So yes, it's a terrible time, but it is also a wonderful time. And there's much to be hopeful about. And I think it's important, especially for young people like you, to see that, to see this pivotal, very important moment in history, that that's a result of your work. That's what you're doing. I mean, this is your moment. And there's a lot of things to be a part of. There's a lot of places to find meaning in your life, and not just in this sort of scripted capitalist milieu that they push us into and tell us, yes, you have to work and make money and accumulate material things and hoard your wealth and look out for yourself and only yourself, or maybe your family at most. These are toxic ethos that are not just polluting humanity. They're not just polluting our spirits and our souls, but they are literally causing our planet to decay and turn to ash. They are, capitalism and the ethos of the ruling capitalist class are literally antithetical to life.
Thank you so much for that answer. There's another question from Samra, who's asking, where is the best place that you would recommend people purchase your books?
Well, if you're in, I don't know what independent bookstores, I always promote independent bookstores to support those small businesses. In the United States, we now have something called bookshop.org. I think it's just in the United States right now. And it's kind of an alternative to Amazon, where people can buy books, and the much of the profit will go to independent bookstores. So
Yeah, hopefully, I think there are similar initiatives in the UK, so I guess they're always better to go to them than the big corporations. Okay, so another question. I don't know who it's from because it's a UCL code instead of their name, but do you think the best way to express Middle Eastern countries' struggles is through the arts? So, for example, your novels, Khalid Hosseini's novels, Banksy's paintings, etc. It seems like that's a strong medium for expressing these strong struggles. So I guess they wanted to ask more about that.
I think there's a lot of ways to express our realities. It can be by picking up a pen. It could be picking up a gun. It can be, picking up a paintbrush, whatever, picking up a stethoscope, you know. I think I think it's important that we know where we can contribute and how we can contribute, what our gifts are, what we have to offer. And but I think you have to start from the premise of struggle, and the premise of service, and of uplifting others, and not just yourself. And I think that's a way of life. So it's not so much, what are the tools and what are the practical details, and what are the steps A through Z, right? It's about, you have to start from, from a spiritual point of service to others, and a struggle for social justice, not just where it impacts you, but how it impacts others, how it impacts wildlife, how it impacts birds and trees, and cows, and dogs. We are, we all get a very finite amount of time on this planet, on this really glorious planet. And I think there has to be a fundamental decision in each person's individual life on how, what is the basis of your actions, whatever they might be, whether it's decision to study whatever you study, or to do whatever you do, or say whatever you say. I think at the start of that, there has to be a decision on what life you want to live. And that's a decision that can change with time. It's not static. We all we can all change our minds and become better people.
Thanks for that. We have another question here as well. Sorry, let me just get it up.
With the hegemonic influence of the with the hegemonic influence of the Zionist lobby in U.S. politics, what has your experience of being a Palestinian advocate in the U.S. been like? Any personal successes or setbacks? Oh gosh, it's, it is so hard to get published in the United States if you're a Palestinian. So I know that, that was initially very difficult for me. And I know it's difficult for a lot of Palestinian writers, especially when their work is critical of Israel. So it's not so much that, there's this lobby, this sort of singular entity that is, sort of polices publishing houses and whatnot. But rather there is this sort of self-censorship among journalists, among publishers, among, the media in general, for fear of accusations of anti-Semitism, for fear of personal reprisals. A lot of people have lost their jobs. They have lost, opportunities for advocating for Palestinians and for social justice when it comes to Palestine. So there is a real fear that is kind of embedded in the psyche in the United States. The lobby operates primarily in politics in Washington, D.C., in shaping foreign policy and sending the United States to various wars that have nothing to do with U.S. interest and everything to do with Israeli interest. And now with this administration, I think activism in general has become a little bit more dangerous too. So yes, of course we are impacted. I think anybody who decides to become an activist is impacted, even in you know, in these so-called democracies. We certainly do have more protections than a lot of than we might in other places, but that doesn't mean that we are safe, and that is increasingly palpable here in the United States. I think I was just talking to a friend of mine, and we were both saying how, yeah, it feels different this time. I think, you know, we've always sort of felt like, yeah, I mean, we do have a certain amount of privilege and a certain amount of protection that's afforded by, you know, this passport that we have that says United States, and by our platforms. But I think that is I think we're starting to understand that no, that's really that's kind of an illusion. But again, you know, it goes back to what life do you want to live, you know?
Lemisa, you're on mute.
Thanks. I knew that would happen at some point. Thank you for that. I have a question from someone who I'm gonna ask to unmute because they prefer to speak out loud. Nora, are you able to speak?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Susan, I just want to say I really loved reading your book. I kind of binge read it in a weekend, and just the pure emotion from reading it was immense. And I just want to say, like, thank you so much for writing it, for giving the voice of Palestinians outside of the statistics that you read and might see. I wanted to ask specifically about one of the hardest parts to read, which was when Ismail was taken from his mother. It was particularly horrible to read, actually, and then seeing that the juxtaposition with Ismail and then now as David. And I wanted to ask if that was a literary device that you used specifically, or whether it was whether there were cases of Israelis stealing Palestinian children, and how you kind of, if it was a literary device that you kind of thought up, how you came to this, because it was very powerful to read, and especially towards the end when he reconciles with Amal. It was really just lovely to read.
Thank you, Nura. And I hear the emotion in your voice, and I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for you. So grateful to hear that you are moved like that. I'm grateful that you read it, and that you have been ruminating on it. There were kidnappings, but the idea actually was not original thought for me, and I wrote this actually in the acknowledgement. Ghassan Kanafani wrote a novella called Return to Haifa, in which the fleeing Palestinian family accidentally leaves their baby boy in a crib, who is then found by the Jewish family that took over the home. And I actually heard that story when I was a child, and I thought it was a real story. And so when I grew up, and I realized it was a novella by Ghassan Kanafani, I intentionally never read it, especially when I was writing this book. I didn't want to be influenced by any of the details. And I still haven't read it, actually. It's the only work of Ghassan Kanafani's that I have not read. But even though Kanafani's account was fictional, kidnappings did happen, and it actually wasn't just from Palestinians. Children were kidnapped from Arab Jews who came from places like Yemen and Morocco and Iraq, because they were taken from their mothers when they were born and given to European Jews to raise, because the European Jews who conquered Palestine very much had European sensibilities of superiority and white supremacy, and so they looked at Arabs, even Jewish Arabs, as being dirty and primitive and etc. So this has been kind of a recent scandal that erupted with a lot of these kidnapped babies sort of, today trying to find their birth parents and whatnot. So it's actually quite known and well documented. The Zionists never really wanted any Arab Jews, but they were small. But because they were small in number and they needed other Jews to complete the conquest of Palestine, they began recruiting all over, Arab Jews to basically make up a kind of underclass of Jews in the country, and to increase their numbers and increase their likelihood of success against the indigenous Palestinians. So, but yeah, so there was always this kind of white supremacist desire to take babies and civilize them, which we also saw here in the United States, right? With Native Americans, there were these schools that were predicated on the mantra of kill the Indian, save the man. That was, basically to destroy Native American society. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's a really awful ethos that they operate on, I think. Sorry, go ahead, Abdullah.
Yeah, I was just saying thank you so much, Nora, for the question, and Susan for your answer. I've just got one eye on the clock. I think there are 3 more questions in the chat, so if possible, we'll try and get through those, but we may not be able to answer more questions after that. But thank you for all of these questions that you have been sending in. And I'll just go to the next one. So, do you see an end to the current status quo, and what can we do to make sure positive change occurs?
To the end to the status quo. I mean, so we kind of already talked about this. What can we do to affect positive change? I don't want to repeat myself, but
yeah.
The status quo is never, it's always dynamic. I mean, history, if you are a student of history, you'll see the ebb and flow of human political thought and social thought and moral evolution, and then devolution, de-evolution. So of course change isn't just possible, it's destined. The question is, which direction do we go in? And but I think what's more critical, what makes this moment far more urgent, is the fact that this physical space in which humans have been operating since the history of humanity is on fire. And so the one thing that cannot be counted on is that our scaffolding is going to stay under our feet. And I worry about future generations. I really do. What this planet, I mean, even in my lifetime, I have seen extraordinary change from what the world looked like when I was a child and what it looks like now. The disappearance of insects. I mean, we used to, when I got my driver's license when I was 16 and I would drive, your windshield was splattered with insects, right? It was just because that's how, they're essential to the ecology. and now they're you know, they're all but gone. And when you read the statistics, there's, you know, it's something like 80% of the insect population is gone. And it's largely due to one company, Monsanto.
Mm.
And there's so many, you know, there's so many, we could have like multiple sessions for weeks on the devastation of our planet and our, you know, local biomes. But I think that that is something that that we can all, or we should all sort of unite around.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There was also, okay, this is a bit of a long question, so I'm not sure if you might want to just follow it along and read it. But Hind says, I love how you tell the story of Mornings in Jenin through the experiences of 4 different generations. I learned so much about Palestinian history and narratives because of it. Was there a chapter that was more difficult or emotional to write? And how would you compare Mornings in Jenin to your other novels in terms of the message that they're sending?
Yeah, sometimes. So the writing process is actually a lot of drudgery. I mean, it's just hours and hours at your computer writing and rewriting things. There were moments in all my books where I just had to step back, and I would, when I was myself deeply affected by what I just wrote. In Mornings in Jenin, the moment I recall was, and I don't want to spoil this for people, but when Fatima met her fate in Lebanon, and that I remember just getting up and crying, mostly because, you know, I think because I had that in my mind, and that was part of my formative years, is knowing what happened in Sabra and Shatila, and then to have this character that I had grown to really love. And I do, this is another thing that, you know, these characters become very real to me, and I have a lot of feelings toward them. You know, most of them I love deeply because they are real to me. And so to have her meet that fate was emotional for me. But otherwise, you know, it's, when I write, I mean, the early drafts are total crap. I mean, I would be embarrassed for anybody to see them. And it's only in the rewriting that the story starts to take shape. And it's when I start to feel things that I know that, okay, I'm getting there. Like this is getting to a point where I can show it to somebody else and not be totally embarrassed. In terms of how it compares to my later novels, I think I became a better writer with each new novel, and I am really, I mean, I feel proud of all of them, and I love all of the characters, and they all have gone out into the world and done different things. You know, in a way, I almost start to feel detached from them. It's kind of like raising a child, and then they're all grown up, and you just kind of, you know, you get peeks at them through the eyes of readers. That's the experience for me as a writer. And this new book, I feel like is my best one, because I became, I think, like I said, I'm a better writer in this book, and the topics were, I needed more maturity and greater skill to write about the subject matter in this book. So
Thank you for that. I think it's one last question. I believe it's from Dean. I might be pronouncing your name wrong, but he says, you've talked about self-hate and feelings of inferiority amongst Arabs, which has been felt by many Jews following the Holocaust. So is there a way to break the cycle of viewing the oppressor as superior merely as a result of their power?
You know, I think on individual levels, you know, we can all do that as individuals. I mean, I think every woman can tell you, at least every woman of my generation grew up in a society that whose every message, every television show, every media campaign was telling her that she's not pretty enough, that she's not good enough, that she's not tall enough, not skinny enough, not light enough, or whatever, all the other things. So self-hate is kind of, it's not just from people who experience colonization or a Holocaust or whatever. Self-hate is profitable. It's there's an industry that is predicated on self-hate, and I think the first thing is recognizing this, and seeing how it shapes our lives, and you can unlearn those things. I spent a great deal of my adulthood unlearning a lot of these messages that I had that had been pounded into my head, whether it was via Israeli occupation, or whether it was living in Kuwait as a second class, sort of Palestinians, or just second class everywhere in the Arab world, whether it was just being a woman taught rather to cater to the sensitivities and the egos of men, and to know my place and not be too loud or too aggressive or whatever. So these are all things that sort of can get embedded in our heads individually and collectively, and it is an individual journey to unlearn these things, and it's absolutely possible, and it's hugely liberating and enriching to us individually. On a collective level, it's of course, collectively we're made of individuals, but it's much harder thing to affect on a larger scale, and that requires governance and laws and social constructs that reject things like racism and colorism and sexism, misogyny, and this is part of human moral evolution. We have evolved to come to understand that slavery is an evil institution, but slavery still exists in the world, and I think that's important. But this has been part of our moral evolution. We have been evolved to understand that women are not property. Maybe someday in the future we will evolve to understand that animals are not on this planet for us to eat or experiment on or use for our entertainment and whatnot. But all of these things require legislation and collective effort.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the people that have been leaving nice messages for Susan in the chat.
Him and Samra and a lot of other people. I'm reading them and I thank you for them.
And there's just one question from Samra asking, what can we do more to support the charity that we mentioned, we spoke about a bit earlier on, the Playgrounds for Palestine charity?
I would say get in touch with the UK chapter, and they can probably, you're all in the UK, so I think that's probably the better place to start, since I know your government matches charitable contributions. There's, depending on your skill set, there's ways to volunteer, whether it's, social media posts or administrative things, or yeah.
Awesome, thank you so much. But with that, I guess, thank you for all of your insights and your contributions in the discussion section and in the Q&A. I think your words have proved to be mesmerizing, both on the page and during this discussion. So I thank you for that. And I think there's a lot of intriguing points and food for thought moving forward. To everyone who's joined us, thank you so much. If you haven't already, do be sure to check out Mornings in Jenin and Against the Loveless World and all of the other books that Susan has authored. But yeah, all the way from Pennsylvania, I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to Susan for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you very much, guys.